You won't believe what happened to them after they were abandoned by their children on Christmas Day. Stay until the end. This story will surprise you. The Christmas lights blinked weakly on the small artificial tree sitting in the corner of the living room. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the quiet streets of Maplewood, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's name, their stories, and sometimes even their secrets. The cold wind whistled through the cracks in the old wooden window frames of the house on Elm Street, a modest two-story home that had witnessed 53 years of marriage, 3 childbirths, countless family dinners, and more love than most people experience in a lifetime. Margaret Sullivan sat in her worn armchair, the same one she had nursed her babies in decades ago, staring at the clock on the wall. It was 7:45 in the evening on Christmas Day. The dining table behind her was set for 5 people, complete with her best china, the set with tiny blue flowers around the edges that she only brought out for special occasions. The turkey she had spent all morning preparing sat in the center, golden brown and steaming, surrounded by mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, and fresh-baked rolls. Everything was perfect, everything except the fact that no one had come. Her husband, Robert, stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the street as if sheer willpower could make their children's cars appear. His shoulders, once broad and strong from years of working construction, now curved slightly with age and the weight of disappointment. He was 76 years old, with silver hair that had once been jet black and deep-set blue eyes that had seen too much heartbreak in recent years. "They're not coming, Robert," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She was 73, with gentle features and grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands, spotted with age and trembling slightly, rested in her lap. "We need to accept it." Robert didn't turn around. "It's only 8 o'clock. Maybe there's traffic. Maybe—" "There's no traffic in Maplewood on Christmas night," she interrupted, tears beginning to stream down her weathered cheeks. "And you know it." He finally turned to face her, and she could see the moisture in his own eyes. In all their years together, she had rarely seen him cry. Robert was the strong one, the provider, the man who fixed everything that broke and solved every problem that arose. But this was something even he couldn't fix. "How did it come to this, Maggie?" he asked, using the nickname he had called her since they were teenagers. "Where did we go wrong?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I've asked myself that same question 1,000 times. I don't have an answer." The house felt unbearably quiet. No children laughing, no grandchildren running through the halls, no sounds of family gathering together to celebrate. Just the ticking of the clock and the distant howl of the winter wind. Their eldest son, David, was 48 years old and lived 3 hours away in the city. He was a successful corporate lawyer with a corner office, expensive suits, and a lifestyle that his parents could barely comprehend. He had called 2 days before Christmas with an excuse that was as transparent as it was painful. "Mom, Dad, I'm really sorry, but Jessica and I are flying to the Bahamas for Christmas this year," he had said, his voice tinged with what Margaret recognized as false regret. "The kids really wanted a tropical vacation, and we already booked everything months ago. You understand, right? We'll visit in the spring, I promise." But spring had come and gone for the past 5 years with no visit. Margaret understood perfectly. She understood that they were no longer a priority in David's life. She understood that his children, her grandchildren, Emma and Noah, were growing up without knowing their grandparents. She understood that success had changed her son into someone she no longer recognized. Their middle child, Patricia, was 45 and lived just 45 minutes away in the neighboring town of Riverside. She worked as a real estate agent and had married a man named Frank, who made no secret of his disdain for what he called small-town people. Patricia had sent a text message on Christmas Eve, not even bothering to call. The message had been brief and cold. "Frank's family is hosting this year. Can't make it. Merry Christmas." No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the hurt it would cause. Margaret had read that message at least 20 times, each time hoping the words might somehow change or reveal some hidden warmth she had initially missed. They never did. And then there was Thomas, their youngest at 42. Tommy, as they still called him, lived the farthest away, all the way across the country. He was a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company and traveled constantly for work. His excuse had come in the form of a voicemail left late on Christmas Eve, when he knew they would already be asleep. "Hey, Mum and Dad, listen, I'm really sorry, but the company is sending me to a conference in Las Vegas over Christmas. I know, terrible timing, right? But it's mandatory, and I could lose my job if I don't go. I'll make it up to you. Love you both." 3 children. 3 excuses. 1 devastating reality. They had been abandoned on the day that mattered most. Robert slowly walked to the table and pulled out a chair, sitting down heavily. He stared at the untouched feast before them, and something inside him seemed to crack. "I worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years to give them everything they needed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I missed sleep, I worked through injuries. I sacrificed so they could have better lives than we had." "I know, sweetheart," Margaret replied, standing up and moving to sit beside him. She placed her wrinkled hand over his larger, work-worn one. "You sewed their clothes when we couldn't afford new ones," he continued, looking at her with red-rimmed eyes. "You stayed up all night when they were sick. You went without so they could have, and this is how they repay us. By forgetting we exist?" Margaret had no answer. The truth was too painful to speak aloud. Their children had become strangers. Somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of their own lives, careers and families, David, Patricia and Thomas had left their parents behind like outdated furniture that no longer fit their modern homes. "Should we eat?" Margaret asked quietly, though she had no appetite. Robert shook his head. "I can't. I'm sorry, Maggie, I just can't." They sat in silence for a long time, holding hands across the table, surrounded by food that would go to waste, and Christmas decorations that now seemed to mock their loneliness. The house on Elm Street had never felt so empty, even though it was filled with memories of better times. Margaret's mind drifted back through the years. She remembered David as a little boy with scraped knees and a gap-toothed smile, running through the house with a toy truck. She remembered Patricia in her pink tutu, dancing around the living room and begging her mother to watch her pirouette just one more time. She remembered Thomas, the baby of the family, clinging to her skirts and crying whenever she left his sight because he loved her so much. Where had those children gone? When had they been replaced by these cold, distant adults who couldn't spare a single day for the people who had given them life? "Maybe we should have said no more often," Robert mused, breaking the silence. "Maybe we spoiled them. We loved them," Margaret corrected gently. "That's not the same as spoiling them. We taught them right from wrong. We taught them kindness and respect and gratitude. They chose to forget those lessons. Then we failed as parents." "No," she said firmly, squeezing his hand. "They failed as children. There's a difference." Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing the small town in white. Neighbors' houses glowed with warm light, and the sounds of celebration could be heard faintly in the distance. The Johnsons next door were hosting their entire extended family, and the sounds of laughter and Christmas carols drifted through the cold night air. It only made the Sullivans' silence more pronounced. At 9 o'clock, Margaret finally stood up and began clearing the table. Robert tried to help, but she waved him away. "I've got it. You go rest." He didn't argue. Instead, he climbed the stairs slowly, each step seeming to take more effort than the last, and disappeared into their bedroom. Margaret heard the door close softly behind him. She stood at the kitchen sink, scraping untouched food into containers, and let herself cry properly for the first time that day. The tears came in waves, each one carrying years of accumulated disappointment, hurt, and confusion. She cried for the family gatherings that no longer happened. She cried for the grandchildren who barely knew her. She cried for the future she had imagined, one where she and Robert would be surrounded by love in their golden years. That had turned out to be nothing but a fantasy. When the kitchen was finally clean and the leftovers were stored away, Margaret turned off all the Christmas lights and made her way upstairs. The house descended into darkness, as dark as the sadness that had settled over it. She found Robert lying in bed, still fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. She changed into her nightgown and slipped under the covers beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he finally whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "I don't know. For everything. For not being enough to make them want to stay in our lives." She rolled onto her side and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You've been the most wonderful husband and father. This isn't about you or me. This is about choices they've made. It doesn't hurt any less knowing that." "No," she agreed softly. "It doesn't." They lay in silence, and eventually exhaustion overtook sadness. Margaret drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with memories of Christmases past, when the house was full of noise and love, and her children still looked at her like she hung the moon. The morning of December 26th dawned cold and grey. Margaret woke to find Robert already up and dressed. She could smell coffee brewing downstairs and hear him moving around in the kitchen. She dressed slowly, her body aching with the kind of tiredness that comes from emotional exhaustion rather than physical exertion. When she came downstairs, she found Robert sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper spread out before him. He looked up when she entered, and she could see that he hadn't slept well. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his face seemed to have aged overnight. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," she replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from him. They sat in silence, the weight of yesterday still hanging heavy between them. Outside, Maplewood was slowly waking up. She could see Mrs. Patterson across the street retrieving her newspaper in her bathrobe, and the sound of children playing with new Christmas toys echoed from somewhere down the block. At 9:37, there was a knock at the front door. Margaret and Robert exchanged confused glances. They weren't expecting anyone. Perhaps one of the neighbors coming to check on them or offer leftover Christmas cookies. Robert stood and walked to the door, opening it to reveal a man in his early 40s wearing a grey suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had short brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that was professionally neutral. "Good morning," the man said. "Are you Robert and Margaret Sullivan?" "Yes," Robert replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man extended his hand. "My name is Richard Winters. I'm an attorney with Hendricks, Morrison and Associates. May I come in? I have some important information to discuss with you both." Robert's first instinct was suspicion. In their 70-some years, they had learned that men in suits rarely brought good news. But something about the attorney's demeanor, professional but not unkind, made him step aside and gesture toward the living room. "Please," Robert said. "Come in." Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Who is it, Robert?" "This is Mr. Winters. He's an attorney. He says he has something important to discuss with us." Margaret's face paled slightly. Her first thought went to their children. Had something happened, an accident? But surely the police would notify them, not a lawyer. The three of them settled into the living room, Robert and Margaret on the couch, the attorney in the armchair. Mr. Winters opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "I apologize for arriving unannounced the day after Christmas," he began, "but the matter is quite time-sensitive, and I've been trying to locate you both for several weeks." "Locate us?" Margaret asked, confused. "We've been right here. We've lived at this address for over 50 years. "I understand," Mr. Winters said with a slight smile. "The difficulty was in confirming your identities and relationship to the deceased." "Deceased?" Robert leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Who died?" Mr. Winters pulled out a photograph from the folder and slid it across the coffee table toward them. Margaret picked it up and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The photograph showed a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair and a radiant smile. She was standing in front of a house, holding a small child, a boy, in her arms. "Do you recognize this woman?" Mr. Winters asked gently. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Eleanor Chen. My God, I haven't thought about her it must be 40 years. Robert leaned over to look at the photograph, and his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to shock. "Ellie," he said softly. "What does she have to do with anything?" Mr. Winters leaned back in his chair. "Eleanor Chen passed away 6 months ago at the age of 68. Before her death, she made very specific arrangements through our firm. Mrs. Sullivan, Miss Chen left explicit instructions that you and your husband were to be found and contacted regarding her estate." "Her estate?" Margaret repeated, still clutching the photograph. "But we lost touch with her decades ago. I don't understand why she would think of us." "Perhaps," Mr. Winters said carefully, "we should start at the beginning. Can you tell me about your relationship with Eleanor Chen?" Margaret set the photograph down on the coffee table with trembling hands, her mind racing backward through time to a period of her life she had tucked away in the corners of her memory. She looked at Robert, whose expression mirrored her own mixture of surprise and uncertainty, before turning her attention back to Mr. Winters. "Eleanor came into our lives in the spring of 1983, Margaret began, her voice soft with remembrance. "I was working as a receptionist at Dr. Harrison's medical practice downtown. The building isn't there anymore. They tore it down years ago to build that shopping center. Anyway, Eleanor came in one afternoon looking absolutely terrified. Robert reached over and took his wife's hand, giving it an encouraging squeeze. Mr. Winters pulled out a notebook and pen, listening intently. "She was young," Margaret continued. Couldn't have been more than 25 or 26 years old. Beautiful girl with the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. She barely spoke English. She had immigrated from Taiwan just 6 months earlier. She was pregnant and alone, and she didn't have health insurance or much money. Dr. Harrison was a good man, may he rest in peace, and he agreed to see her at a reduced rate. That's when you befriended her? Mr. Winters asked. Not right away, Margaret admitted. At first I just did what I could to help her navigate the appointments and paperwork. Her English was limited, and everything about the American healthcare system confused her. But over the weeks we started talking more. She would come in for her prenatal checkups, and we'd chat in the waiting room. She told me her story. Margaret paused, closing her eyes as the memories came flooding back with surprising clarity. Eleanor had come to this country with her husband, a man named James Chen. He was American-born but of Taiwanese descent. They had met in Taipei when he was there for business. According to Eleanor, he swept her off her feet, promised her a wonderful life in America, and convinced her to marry him and move here. She left everything behind, her family, her friends, her entire life, because she believed in his promises. But the reality was different, Robert interjected quietly. Mr. Winters looked at him, and Robert nodded. I met her a few times when I'd pick Maggie up from work. She was a sweet girl, but you could see the sadness in her eyes. She tried to hide it, but it was there. What happened to her husband? Mr. Winters asked. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. James Chen was a liar and a coward. Within 3 months of bringing Eleanor to this country, his true nature revealed itself. He was a gambler, Mr. Winters. He would disappear for days at a time, gambling away his paychecks at underground card games and illegal betting operations. He'd come home broke, sometimes drunk, sometimes violent. She paused, her jaw tightening at the memory. By the time Eleanor found out she was pregnant, James had drained their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and put them in serious debt. When she told him about the baby, hoping it might change him, do you know what he did? Mr. Winters waited silently. He left, Margaret said, her voice filled with old anger. Just packed a bag in the middle of the night and disappeared. Left her alone in a country where she barely spoke the language, pregnant, with no money, no job, and nowhere to go. She came into the doctor's office the day after he left, and I could tell something was terribly wrong. When I asked her what happened, she broke down crying right there in the waiting room. Robert squeezed his wife's hand again. Maggie has always had a soft heart for people in trouble. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I brought her home that night, Margaret said. We had a spare bedroom upstairs. David was away at college. Patricia was 17, and Thomas was 14. I talked to Robert, and we agreed that Eleanor could stay with us until she got back on her feet. You took in a stranger? Mr. Winters asked, his professional demeanor softening slightly with admiration. She wasn't a stranger, Margaret corrected gently. She was a young woman in desperate need of help. What kind of person would I be if I turned my back on her? My own mother always taught me that kindness costs nothing but means everything. Mr. Winters made a note in his book. How long did she stay with you? Almost a year, Robert answered, from April of '83 until February of '84. She was with us when her son was born that July, a beautiful baby boy she named Daniel. Maggie was right there in the delivery room with her, holding her hand through the whole thing because Ellie had nobody else. Margaret's eyes grew distant with memory. I'll never forget the look on her face when they placed Daniel in her arms for the first time. Despite everything she had been through, the abandonment, the fear, the uncertainty, she looked at that baby with such pure love. She told me, Mrs. Sullivan, he is my reason for everything now. I will give him the life I dreamed of having. She lived with us and helped around the house, Robert added. She insisted on earning her keep, even though we told her it wasn't necessary. She cooked. Lord, could that woman cook? And she cleaned and helped Maggie with anything that needed doing. Our kids loved her, too. She was like part of the family. What happened after February of '84? Mr. Winters asked. Margaret's expression shifted to something more complex, a mixture of sadness and pride. Eleanor was one of the most determined people I've ever met. While she was living with us, she was working tirelessly to build a future for herself and Daniel. She found work cleaning offices at night while the baby slept, took English classes at the community center during the day, and saved every single penny she earned. She barely slept, Robert remembered. We'd hear her up at all hours, studying English or taking care of Daniel. We worried about her running herself into the ground, but she was driven by something powerful. She had this dream of opening her own business someday, a small restaurant serving traditional Taiwanese food. By February, she had saved enough money to rent a small apartment across town, Margaret continued. It wasn't much, a tiny one-bedroom place above a laundromat, but it was hers. She was so proud. I helped her move in and she cried when she thanked us. She said we had saved her life and given her hope when she had none left. Did you stay in contact after she moved out? Mr. Winters asked. Margaret nodded. Oh yes, for several years. She would visit every few weeks, always bringing some dish she had cooked to share with us. Daniel grew from a baby into a toddler, and we watched him take his first steps, heard his first words. Eleanor continued working multiple jobs while studying for her citizenship test. She passed it in 1987 and was so proud to become an American citizen. By 1988, she had saved enough to make her dream come true, Robert said with a smile. She opened a small restaurant on Maple Avenue, Chen's Kitchen she called it. It was tiny, maybe 10 tables, but she ran it herself with just one cook to help her. The food was incredible. She worked 7 days a week, but she was happy. She was building something for herself and her son. Margaret's smile faded slightly. That's also when we started seeing her less frequently. She was so busy with the restaurant, and we understood. We'd stop by to eat there whenever we could, and she'd always refuse to let us pay. You gave me everything, she'd say. I can never repay you, but I can feed you. We'd argue with her, but she was stubborn. Then life got complicated for all of us, Robert added. The early 90s were tough years for our family. Margaret's mother got sick with cancer and needed constant care. I was working overtime trying to save for the kids' college funds. Patricia got married in '92 and moved away. Thomas graduated high school and went to college. We were stretched thin in every direction. Eleanor's restaurant was becoming more successful, Margaret said, and she was talking about maybe opening a second location. Daniel was growing up into such a bright, polite boy. The last time I saw her was in 1995. I stopped by the restaurant and we talked for almost 2 hours. She told me she was seeing someone, a good man who treated her and Daniel well. She seemed happy, truly happy, for the first time since I'd known her. Margaret paused, her expression growing regretful. She gave me her new phone number because she had moved to a better apartment, and she made me promise to stay in touch. I promised I would, but then life just got in the way. My mother passed away that summer, and I fell into a deep depression. David's wife had their first baby, and we were trying to be involved grandparents. The holidays came and went. I kept meaning to call Eleanor, but weeks turned into months and months turned into years. By the time I thought about reaching out again, she continued, her voice thick with regret. So much time had passed that I felt ashamed. What would I say? Sorry I disappeared from your life for 5 years. I drove past Chen's Kitchen once in 2000, and there was a different restaurant in that location. I assumed she had moved her business somewhere else, or maybe closed it. I could have tried harder to find her, but I didn't. I failed her. Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks, and Robert put his arm around her shoulders. We both failed her, he said quietly. We let a woman who meant so much to us just slip away because we were too busy with our own lives. It's one of my biggest regrets. Mr. Winters set down his pen and looked at the elderly couple with compassion. Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, I need to tell you something that might ease your conscience somewhat. In 1996, Eleanor married the man she had mentioned to you, a businessman named Henry Wu. They moved to Seattle where his company was headquartered. She sold Chen's Kitchen and started a new life there. Seattle, Margaret repeated softly. That's why I couldn't find the restaurant. Yes, Mr. Winters confirmed. Eleanor went on to have a very successful life. She and Henry opened a chain of restaurants throughout the Pacific Northwest, 15 locations at their peak. She became quite wealthy, actually. They also had a daughter together in 1997, a girl they named Grace. A daughter, Margaret whispered, smiling through her tears. I'm so glad she found happiness. She deserved it more than anyone. Daniel, her son, graduated from Stanford University and became a software engineer, Mr. Winters continued. Grace became a pediatric surgeon. Eleanor lived to see both of her children succeed beyond her wildest dreams. By all accounts, she had a wonderful marriage, a thriving business, and a fulfilling life. Then why, Robert began, but Mr. Winters held up a hand. Let me finish the story, the attorney said gently. In 2015, Henry Wu passed away from a sudden heart attack. Eleanor was devastated. She sold most of the restaurants, keeping just 2, and went into semi-retirement. Daniel and Grace were both married with their own families by then, living in different cities. Eleanor spent her time between her remaining 2 restaurants and volunteering at organizations that helped immigrant women, particularly those escaping domestic violence or difficult situations. Margaret's hand went to her heart. Of course she would do that. She never forgot where she came from. In early 2024, Eleanor was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, Mr. Winters said, his voice softening. She was given 6 to 9 months to live. She immediately began putting her affairs in order, and that included a very specific conversation with me. She hired our firm to help her draft her will and execute her final wishes. The living room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret and Robert sat frozen, waiting for whatever would come next. Eleanor told me a story, Mr. Winters continued, a story about 2 people who took her in when she had nowhere else to go. 2 people who asked for nothing in return, but offered her everything: shelter, food, kindness, hope, and love. She said that without you, she would have been homeless and alone with a newborn baby. She might have died or ended up on the streets. Instead, you gave her the foundation she needed to build the life she dreamed of. We just did what any decent person would do, Margaret protested. That's precisely what she said you would say, Mr. Winters replied with a small smile, but Eleanor disagreed. She said that most people would have walked past her, ignored her, or offered token sympathy without real help. You opened your home and your hearts to a stranger. You treated her like family. You gave her dignity when she had lost everything. He pulled out another document from his folder. Eleanor spent the last months of her life making very careful arrangements. She reached out to organizations, established charitable foundations, and ensured that her children and grandchildren were well provided for. But she set aside a very specific portion of her estate with very specific instructions. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor Chen Wu's estate was valued at approximately $42 million at the time of her death, Mr. Winters said, watching their faces carefully. After taxes, charitable donations, and bequests to her children and grandchildren, there remained a sum that she designated for a special purpose. He slid a document across the coffee table toward them. Robert picked it up with shaking hands, and Margaret leaned in to read it with him. The official letterhead read, "Final Testament and Last Will of Eleanor Chen Wu." Their eyes scanned down the page until they reached a paragraph highlighted in yellow. "To Robert and Margaret Sullivan of Maplewood, who saved my life and gave me hope when I had none, who asked for nothing but gave me everything, who showed me that goodness still exists in this world, I leave the sum of $5 million to be delivered to them with my eternal gratitude and love. Without them, none of my success would have been possible. This is not payment, as their kindness is beyond price. This is simply my way of saying thank you and of hoping that they can live their remaining years in comfort and peace, knowing that their compassion changed a life forever." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth as she began to sob. Robert stared at the document, reading the words over and over as if they might change or disappear. $5 million, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor left us $5 million. "That is correct," Mr. Winters confirmed. "The funds have been held in trust, pending verification of your identities and current address. Now that I've found you and confirmed who you are, the money can be transferred to you immediately. Eleanor also left you a personal letter which I'm authorized to give you now." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope with Robert and Margaret Sullivan written in elegant handwriting on the front. Margaret took it with trembling hands, staring at her name written by someone she hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. She carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of cream-colored stationery covered in the same elegant script. Robert moved closer, and they read together, their tears falling onto the pages as they absorbed Eleanor's final words to them. "My dearest Robert and Margaret, if you are reading this letter, then I have passed from this world. I hope my death was peaceful, though knowing my stubborn nature, I probably fought until the very end. Such is the way of survivors. I have thought of you both countless times over the years. Not a day went by that I didn't remember your kindness. When I tucked Daniel into bed each night, I thought of the bedroom you gave us in your home. When I tasted success, I remembered the bitterness of my lowest moment and the sweetness of your compassion. When I held my daughter Grace for the first time, I thought of how you, Margaret, held my hand through Daniel's birth and made me feel less alone. I owe you an apology for losing touch. Life became busy, wonderfully, gloriously busy, and I allowed too much time to pass. I told myself I would reconnect with you eventually, but eventually became never. This is one of my greatest regrets. I should have made more effort. I should have made sure you knew what you meant to me. Please understand that not a single success I achieved, not a single happy moment I experienced, would have been possible without you. You gave me more than shelter. You gave me dignity. You gave me hope. You treated me not as a charity case, but as a human being worthy of respect and love. You showed me that I could survive, that I could thrive, that my son and I deserved a good life. This money I leave you is inadequate to express my gratitude, but I hope it brings you comfort and joy in your remaining years. Use it for whatever brings you happiness. Travel the world, spoil yourselves, give to causes you believe in, or simply rest easy knowing that your future is secure. You earned this through your compassion, even though you never expected anything in return. I learned from you that kindness ripples outward in ways we cannot imagine. Because you helped me, I was able to help others. I spent many years volunteering with organizations that support immigrant women and victims of domestic violence. I told your story often, how two strangers saved my life to inspire others to show compassion. I hope I honored you through those actions. Robert and Margaret, you are the best of humanity. You are proof that goodness exists. You are the reason I never gave up on people, even when life was hard. Thank you for being my guardian angels when I needed them most. Thank you for loving me and my son when we had no one else. Thank you for showing me that home is not a place, but the people who care for you. I love you both. I always have. I always will. Please live beautifully. You deserve every happiness. With eternal gratitude and love, Eleanor. By the time they finished reading, both Margaret and Robert were crying openly. The grief and disappointment of yesterday's abandonment by their own children collided with the overwhelming gratitude of this unexpected gift from someone they had helped so long ago. She remembered us, Margaret sobbed. After all these years, after everything she achieved, she remembered us. Of course she did, Mr. Winters said softly. What you did for her shaped the entire trajectory of her life. She never forgot that. Robert wiped his eyes and looked at the attorney. What do we need to do? Is there paperwork? Quite a bit, actually, Mr. Winters admitted, pulling out more documents. I'll need you to sign these forms acknowledging receipt of the inheritance. I'll also need your banking information so we can arrange the wire transfer. The money should be in your account within 3 to 5 business days. For the next hour, they worked through the paperwork. Margaret's hand shook so badly that she could barely sign her name. Robert had to stop several times to compose himself. When everything was finally completed, Mr. Winters packed up his briefcase and stood. I know this is overwhelming, he said, and you'll need time to process everything. If you have any questions or concerns in the coming days, please don't hesitate to contact me. My direct number is on my card. Robert showed him to the door. As Mr. Winters stepped out into the cold December morning, he turned back one more time. For what it's worth, he said, Eleanor spoke about you both with tremendous love and respect. She considered you family. She wanted you to know that. After the attorney left, Margaret and Robert stood in their living room holding each other and crying. The house that had felt so empty and dark just 24 hours ago suddenly felt different, not filled with the family they had hoped for, but touched by an unexpected grace they never could have imagined. $5 million, Robert said again, as if testing the reality of the words. Maggie, do you understand what this means? It means Eleanor never forgot us, she replied. It means that the kindness we showed her mattered. It means something good came from doing the right thing. They sat down on the couch together, still holding Eleanor's letter, reading and rereading her words. Outside, Maplewood went about its business, unaware that the elderly couple on Elm Street had just had their entire world turned upside down. The phone rang at 2:30 in the afternoon, startling them both. Robert stood and walked to the kitchen to answer it. Hello? Dad? It's David. Robert's jaw tightened. The sound of his eldest son's voice, just one day after he had chosen a vacation over his parents, sparked a complicated mixture of emotions. Hello, David, Robert said, his tone carefully neutral. Hey, listen, I was just calling to wish you and Mom a Merry Christmas. I know we couldn't make it yesterday, but I wanted to check in and make sure you guys are doing okay. Robert looked through the doorway at Margaret, who had stood up and was watching him with a questioning expression. He covered the mouthpiece and whispered, It's David. Her expression hardened slightly. We're fine, Robert said into the phone, his voice cool. "Your mother and I had a quiet Christmas, very quiet." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Right. Well, good. That's good. Listen, Dad, I was thinking maybe Jessica and I could drive out to visit in a few weeks. The kids are asking about you and Mom." "Are they?" Robert asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "That's interesting considering they haven't seen us in over 2 years. Dad, come on. I need to go, David. Your mother and I have things to discuss, important things." "Is everything okay? You sound upset." "Everything is fine. We'll talk later." Robert hung up before David could respond. He walked back into the living room and sat down heavily beside Margaret. "What did he want?" she asked. "To assuage his guilt," Robert replied. "To pretend like abandoning us yesterday was perfectly acceptable, and that a phone call today makes up for it." Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Then she picked up Eleanor's letter again and read a particular passage aloud. "I learned from you that kindness ripples outward in ways we cannot imagine. Because you helped me, I was able to help others." She looked at Robert. "We gave Eleanor compassion when she had nothing. Our own children who have everything gave us nothing. Not even their time. Not even their presence on one day that mattered." "What are you thinking?" Robert asked, though he could see the wheels turning in his wife's mind. "I'm thinking," Margaret said slowly, "that this money is a gift we didn't ask for and don't really need. We've lived modestly our whole lives. We own this house outright. Our needs are simple. What if we use this money to honor Eleanor's memory by helping others the way we once helped her?" "What about the kids?" Robert asked. "Don't you think we should tell them?" Margaret's expression grew contemplative. "Eventually, perhaps. But not yet. Right now I want to sit with this. I want to think about what Eleanor would want us to do. I want to understand what this all means." "You're not wrong to want that," Robert agreed. "But you know they'll find out eventually. Money has a way of changing things, Maggie. People have a way of appearing when they smell inheritance." "Then let them appear," Margaret said, a hint of steel in her voice that Robert rarely heard. "And we'll see what their true motivations are. We'll see if they love us or if they love what we can give them." They spent the rest of the day in a kind of shocked silence, alternately crying, laughing in disbelief, and reading Eleanor's letter over and over. The Christmas decorations, which had seemed so mocking yesterday, now felt different, like witnesses to both the worst and best moments of their lives happening within 24 hours of each other. As night fell over Maplewood, Margaret stood at the window where Robert had stood the night before, looking out at the quiet street. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was blanketed in pristine white. "Robert," she said softly, "I've been thinking about something Eleanor wrote in her letter. She said she told our story to inspire others to show compassion. What if we used this money to create something permanent? Something that would help people the way we helped her?" Robert came to stand beside her, placing his hand on the small of her back. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know exactly, but Eleanor turned her pain into purpose. She used her success to help other immigrant women. What if we did something similar? What if we created a foundation or a shelter or something that would give people a second chance?" "That's a beautiful idea," Robert said, pulling her close. "Eleanor would love that." They stood together at the window, an elderly couple who had been abandoned by their children on Christmas, but had been remembered and cherished by someone they had helped decades ago. The irony was not lost on them. Tomorrow the money would start the process of being transferred. Tomorrow their lives would begin to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow the questions would start and the complications would arise. But tonight they simply held each other and mourned for the children they had raised who had forgotten them, while celebrating the life of a woman they had helped who never did. The house on Elm Street stood quiet in the winter night, holding the secrets of 2 families, one bound by blood but broken by neglect, and one bound by kindness and gratitude that transcended time and distance. And somewhere, perhaps, Eleanor Chen Wu was at peace, knowing that her final gift had been delivered to the 2 people who had once given her everything when she had nothing. The following 3 days passed in a blur of disbelief, paperwork, and whispered conversations between Margaret and Robert. They moved through their familiar routines, morning coffee, reading the newspaper, preparing meals, but everything felt different now, as if they were living in a parallel version of their own lives where the rules had suddenly changed. On December 29th, at precisely 10:42 in the morning, Robert's phone rang. It was their bank manager, a pleasant woman named Carol Henderson, who had worked at Maplewood Community Bank for nearly 20 years. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual with barely contained excitement, "I wanted to personally notify you that a wire transfer has been completed into your joint checking account. Given the substantial nature of the deposit, I thought it appropriate to call and confirm that you were expecting it." Robert's heart began to pound. "Yes, Carol, we were expecting it." "Wonderful. The funds are now available in your account. The exact amount is $5,000,000. I've also taken the liberty of scheduling an appointment for you and Mrs. Sullivan to meet with our financial advisor. A sum of this magnitude really should be properly invested and—" "Thank you, Carol," Robert interrupted gently. "We'll be in touch about the appointment. We appreciate your call." After he hung up, Robert sat down heavily at the kitchen table where Margaret was preparing lunch. She looked at him, reading his expression immediately. "It's real," he said simply. "The money is in our account." Margaret set down the knife she had been using to slice tomatoes and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over to Robert and placed both hands on his shoulders. Eleanor kept her promise, even from beyond the grave. They logged into their online banking account together on Robert's laptop, a machine their grandson Noah had set up for them years ago before the visits stopped. The account balance appeared on the screen in stark black numbers, $5,237.63. The $237.63 represented their previous balance, accumulated through decades of careful savings and Robert's pension checks. "Look at that," Margaret whispered, staring at the screen. "We're millionaires." The word felt foreign in her mouth. Millionaires were other people. People in cities, people with fancy cars and vacation homes, people nothing like Robert and Margaret Sullivan, who had worn the same winter coats for 15 years and still used coupons at the grocery store. "What do we do now?" Robert asked, voicing the question that had been hovering between them for days. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "I've been thinking about that. I made a list." She retrieved a piece of paper from her pocket, an old envelope on which she had scribbled notes in her neat handwriting. Robert smiled despite himself. His wife had been making lists on the backs of envelopes for as long as he could remember. Some things, thankfully, never changed. "First," she said, reading from her list, "we don't tell the children yet. Not until we understand their true intentions." "Agreed," Robert said. "What else?" "Second, we need to get proper financial advice. We've never handled this kind of money. We could lose it all if we're not careful. I want to honor Eleanor's gift by being responsible with it." "Also agreed. What's third?" Margaret's expression softened. "Third, we help people. Just like Eleanor wanted, just like she did. We create something lasting that will help others who are in the situations we've faced, or that Eleanor faced." "A foundation?" Robert suggested. "Maybe, or a shelter, or a scholarship fund, or all three. I don't know exactly what form it should take, but I know we can't just sit on this money and do nothing with it. That wouldn't be right." Robert reached over and took her hand. "Eleanor chose well when she left this to us. You have such a good heart, Maggie." "We both do," she corrected. "We're in this together, just like we've always been." They spent the afternoon researching financial advisors, charitable foundations, and legal requirements for establishing non-profit organizations. The internet, which had always seemed vaguely intimidating to them, suddenly became a valuable tool. They took notes, made more lists, and slowly began to formulate a plan. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Margaret answered it to find their neighbor, Helen Patterson, standing on the porch with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. "Margaret, dear," Helen said with a sympathetic smile, "I made you and Robert some chicken pot pie. I noticed your children didn't come for Christmas, and I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal." Margaret felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Helen meant well, but the reminder of their children's absence stung. At the same time, she recognized genuine kindness when she saw it. The same kind of kindness that had prompted her and Robert to help Eleanor all those years ago. "That's very thoughtful of you, Helen. Would you like to come in for coffee?" "Oh, I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding. Please, come in." Helen stepped inside, and Margaret led her to the kitchen where Robert was still sitting at the laptop. He closed it quickly, an instinctive gesture to protect their newfound secret. "Hello, Robert," Helen said warmly. "I was just telling Margaret that I wanted to bring you both something. I know the holidays can be difficult." "They certainly can be," Robert agreed carefully. "Thank you for thinking of us." As Margaret prepared coffee, Helen settled into a chair and folded her hands in her lap. She was a widow in her late 60s, a kind woman who had lived across the street for 30 years. Her own children visited regularly. Margaret had watched them arrive for Christmas, arms full of presents, staying late into the evening. The contrast had been painful. "I hope I'm not overstepping," Helen said gently, "but I couldn't help but notice that your children didn't come this year. Are they all right? Is everyone healthy?" Margaret and Robert exchanged a glance. They had always been private people, not given to airing their family problems to neighbors, but something about the past few days had shifted their perspective. "They're fine," Margaret said, setting coffee cups on the table. "They were all just too busy with their own lives to visit. It happens." Helen's expression showed that she understood what wasn't being said. "I'm sorry, that must have been hard." "It was," Robert admitted. "It was one of the hardest days of our lives, actually. But," Margaret added, sitting down and wrapping her hands around her coffee cup, "something unexpected happened the next day. Something wonderful." She proceeded to tell Helen about Eleanor, about the young woman they had helped 40 years ago, about Eleanor's success, about her death, and about the extraordinary gift she had left them. Robert interjected details occasionally, and together they painted a picture of kindness, rewarded in ways they never could have imagined. Helen listened with wide eyes, her coffee growing cold as the story unfolded. When they finished, she sat back in her chair, shaking her head in amazement. $5 million, she breathed. "Margaret, Robert, that's incredible. That's like something from a movie." "It doesn't feel real yet," Margaret admitted. "Part of me keeps thinking I'll wake up and discover it was all a dream." "What will you do with it?" Helen asked. "Help people," Margaret said simply. "Eleanor gave us this gift because we helped her when she needed it most. The only way to truly honor that is to pass the kindness forward." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "You two are remarkable. Most people would be planning vacations or new cars or—" "We're too old for fancy vacations," Robert interrupted with a slight smile. "And our car runs just fine. We don't need much for ourselves, never have." After Helen left, promising to keep their secret and offering to help in any way she could, Margaret and Robert returned to their planning. As evening fell, they realized they were hungry and decided to heat up the pot pie Helen had brought. They were just sitting down to eat when Robert's phone rang again. This time it was Patricia. Robert answered cautiously. "Hello, Patricia." "Hi, Dad." Her voice sounded strained, almost nervous. "Listen, I wanted to apologize for missing Christmas. Frank's family can be really demanding, and I felt like I couldn't say no to them. But I was thinking maybe I could drive out this weekend to visit. Would that work?" Robert's grip tightened on the phone. In the past, he would have immediately said yes, grateful for whatever scraps of attention his children chose to throw his way. But something had shifted. The pain of Christmas Day was still too fresh, and Eleanor's letter had reminded him of what real gratitude and loyalty looked like. "Actually, Patricia, this weekend isn't good for us. Your mother and I have plans." There was a surprised pause. "Plans? What kind of plans?" "Personal plans. We're busy." "Oh, okay, well, what about next weekend?" "I don't know yet. We'll have to see how things go. Why don't you call us in a few weeks and we'll figure something out?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, is everything okay? You sound different." "Everything is fine. I need to go now." "Your mother is calling me." He hung up before she could respond. Margaret, who had been listening to his side of the conversation, raised her eyebrows. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Robert admitted, "but it felt necessary. I'm tired of being treated like an obligation, Maggie. I'm tired of our children only remembering we exist when it's convenient for them." "So am I," she agreed, "but you know this will confuse them. They're used to us always being available, always accommodating their schedules." "Good. Let them be confused. Maybe it will make them think about how they've been treating us." Over the next week, the calls continued. David phoned 3 times, each time sounding slightly more concerned that his father wasn't acting normal. Thomas finally called on January 4th, 11 days after Christmas, with an excuse about being swamped with work and a vague suggestion about visiting sometime soon. Robert and Margaret gave all 3 children the same response. They were busy with personal matters and would reach out when they had time. It was a complete reversal of their usual dynamic, and it clearly unsettled their children. Meanwhile, Margaret and Robert met with a financial advisor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Susan Chen, a coincidence that felt almost like a sign from Eleanor. Susan helped them set up a diversified investment portfolio, establish a trust, and begin the process of creating a charitable foundation. What do you want to call your foundation? Susan asked during their second meeting. Margaret and Robert looked at each other. They had discussed this question at length. The Eleanor Chen Second Chances Foundation, Margaret said firmly. We want her name to be remembered. We want people to know her story. That's beautiful, Susan said, making notes. And what will be the foundation's mission? To help immigrant women and families in crisis, Robert explained. Women who are alone, afraid, or escaping difficult situations. We want to provide temporary housing, English classes, job training, legal assistance, and financial support to help them build new lives. Exactly the kind of help Eleanor needed when she had nothing, Margaret added. If we can help even one person the way we helped her, this money will have been well spent. Susan worked with them to draft bylaws, file paperwork with the state, and begin the process of establishing the foundation as a legitimate non-profit organization. The legal work was complex and time-consuming, but Margaret and Robert attacked it with a determination they hadn't felt in years. They also made some personal decisions. They paid off the small remaining balance on their house, just $6,000, but it felt liberating to own their home completely. They set aside money for any future medical expenses and established a generous fund to ensure neither of them would ever be a financial burden on anyone. Then they made a list of people in their community who needed help, people they had known for years, but who had fallen on hard times. There was James Morrison, the widower down the street, whose wife had died leaving him with crushing medical debt. There was the Rodriguez family, whose teenage son needed surgery that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. There was the community center that desperately needed renovations, but couldn't afford them. One by one, anonymously, Margaret and Robert began writing checks. James Morrison received an envelope in his mailbox containing a check for $15,000 with a note that said simply, "Your debts are paid. Live free." He showed up on their doorstep crying, asking if they knew who had done this. They shook their heads and shared his joy, keeping their secret. The Rodriguez family found a check for $25,000 slipped under their door with a note, "For Miguel's surgery and recovery. He deserves to be healthy." Mrs. Rodriguez called everyone she knew trying to find her anonymous benefactor. Margaret heard about it at the grocery store and smiled to herself. The community center received a donation of $100,000 from an anonymous donor specifically designated for renovations and new equipment. The director, a kind man named Paul Hutchins, announced it at a town meeting with tears in his eyes, saying it was a miracle. Margaret and Robert sat in the audience of that meeting, holding hands, saying nothing. This was what Eleanor had wanted. This was what the money was for. Not to make them comfortable, they were already comfortable enough, but to ease the burdens of others, to provide hope where there was despair, to be the kind of people Eleanor had believed them to be. By mid-January, word had begun to spread through Maplewood about the mysterious benefactor who was helping people. Theories abounded. Some thought it was a wealthy business person from the city who had ties to the town. Others thought it might be lottery winners. A few even suggested it might be someone local, but no one suspected the elderly couple on Elm Street who shopped with coupons and drove a 15-year-old sedan. On January 18th, 3 weeks after receiving Eleanor's inheritance, Margaret and Robert invited Helen Patterson over for tea. They had grown closer to their neighbor in recent weeks, and Helen had proven to be discreet and helpful as they navigated their new reality. "I have a question for you," Margaret said as they sat in the living room with their teacups. "The foundation is moving forward. We'll be able to start accepting applications for assistance soon. But we need someone to help run it, someone trustworthy who understands what we're trying to do." Helen set down her cup. "What are you asking?" "We're asking if you would consider being the director," Robert said. "It would be paid, of course, a proper salary. But more importantly, we need someone who shares our values. Someone who won't treat the people who need help as charity cases, but as human beings who deserve dignity." Helen's eyes widened. "I've never run a foundation before. I worked as a school secretary for 30 years, but that's very different from—" "You know this community," Margaret interrupted gently. "You know who needs help and why. You're organized, compassionate, and discreet. Those qualities matter more than experience." "And we'll help you," Robert added. "We're not looking for someone to do this alone. We'll be involved every step of the way. We just need someone younger and more energetic to handle the day-to-day operations." Helen was quiet for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. "My husband died 5 years ago. Since then, I've been trying to find purpose, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. This feels like an answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. Is that a yes? Margaret asked with a smile. That's a yes, Helen confirmed, reaching across to squeeze Margaret's hand. When do we start? They spent the next 2 hours discussing plans, ideas, and logistics. Helen brought fresh perspectives and asked smart questions. By the time she left, they had outlined a clear vision for the Foundation's first year. That evening, as Margaret and Robert prepared for bed, the phone rang one more time. It was David again. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, his voice taking on a tone that Robert recognized from his son's professional life, the voice he used when negotiating contracts or deposing witnesses. "I've been calling for weeks, and you keep putting me off. Patricia and Tom have said the same thing. What's going on? Are you and Mom upset about Christmas?" Robert sat down on the edge of the bed. Margaret, who could hear David's voice through the phone, came to sit beside him. "David," Robert said carefully, "your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately, about family, about priorities, about what really matters in life." "Okay," David said slowly. And we've realized that we've made it too easy for you and your brother and sister to take us for granted. We've always been available whenever you needed us, but you're never available when we need you. That has to change." "Dad, that's not fair. We all have busy lives." "So do we," Robert interrupted. "Just because we're retired doesn't mean our time is worthless, or that we're just sitting here waiting for you to remember we exist. We have things going on, important things, things that matter to us." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. David was clearly not accustomed to his father pushing back. "What kind of things?" David finally asked, and Robert heard the first hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. "That's not really your concern right now," Robert said. "What is your concern is that your mother and I are no longer going to accept being treated like we're at the bottom of your priority list. If you want to be part of our lives, you'll need to make a real effort. And that effort starts with understanding that abandoning us on Christmas was deeply hurtful. I didn't abandon you. I told you weeks in advance that we had other plans. You chose a vacation over your parents," Robert said bluntly. "Your sister chose her husband's family over us. Your brother chose a work conference that, knowing him, probably wasn't even mandatory. You all made choices, David. We're allowed to react to those choices." Another long silence, then David's voice came back, quieter now, almost defensive. "So what? You're punishing us?" "No," Margaret interjected, leaning closer to the phone so David could hear her. "We're protecting ourselves. There's a difference." "Mom, are you serious right now?" "Very serious, David. Your father and I are not going to spend whatever years we have left begging for crumbs of attention from our children. We raised you better than this. We taught you about respect, loyalty, and family. If you've forgotten those lessons, that's your choice. But we're done pretending it doesn't hurt." They could hear David breathing on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less defensive, more uncertain. "I didn't realize you felt this way." "Because you never asked," Margaret said gently. "You assumed we'd always be fine, always be understanding, always be there waiting whenever you decided to show up. We're human beings with feelings, David. We're your parents, and we deserve better." "Can we talk about this in person?" David asked. "Can I come visit soon?" Robert and Margaret looked at each other. Margaret nodded slightly. "Yes," Robert said, "but you come alone, David. Not with Jessica and the kids. Not as a family visit, just you. Because this conversation is between you and us. It's long overdue." "Okay," David agreed, sounding shaken. "How about next weekend, Saturday?" "Saturday works. Come for lunch. We'll expect you at noon." After Robert hung up, he and Margaret sat in silence for a few moments. "Do you think he'll actually come?" Margaret asked. "I think he will," Robert replied. "I think we finally got his attention. Now we'll see if he's capable of real change, or if this is just temporary guilt." "What about Patricia and Thomas?" "They'll come too, eventually. David will talk to them. He'll tell them something's different with us, and they'll get curious. People always get curious when the dynamic changes." Margaret reached over and turned off the bedside lamp. In the darkness, she said softly, "Eleanor would be proud of us. We're using her gift not just to help others, but to help ourselves, to demand the respect and love we deserve." "I hope she knows," Robert said. "Wherever she is, I hope Eleanor knows that her kindness is still rippling outward, still changing lives, including ours." They fell asleep holding hands, two people who had been broken by abandonment just 3 weeks earlier, but who were now being rebuilt by the memory of someone who had never forgotten their compassion. Outside, Maplewood slept under a blanket of stars. The house on Elm Street stood quiet, holding its secrets, a fortune that could buy comfort but was being used to buy dignity, hope, and second chances for others. And in Seattle, Eleanor Chen Wu's grave bore a simple inscription. She turned kindness into legacy. Though neither Margaret nor Robert had visited that grave yet, they would. Soon they would make the journey to pay their respects, to thank their old friend, and to show her that her faith in them had not been misplaced. But first, they had a lunch to prepare and a difficult conversation to have with their eldest son. The conversation that would determine whether their family could be healed or whether the distance that had grown between them was too wide to cross. The money had changed everything and nothing. It had given them security and opportunity, but more importantly, it had given them clarity. Clarity about what mattered, about who valued them, and about the kind of people they wanted to be with whatever time they had left. Eleanor's gift was not just $5 million. It was perspective, purpose, and the courage to demand better from the people who should have loved them most. Saturday morning arrived with a mixture of anxiety and determination hanging over the house on Elm Street. Margaret woke early, as she always did, and found Robert already in the kitchen making coffee. Neither of them had slept particularly well. The impending conversation with David weighed heavily on their minds. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked as she tied her robe and joined him at the table. "Terrified," Robert admitted, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "I've never confronted any of our children like this before. I don't know how he'll react." "However he reacts, we'll handle it together," Margaret said firmly. "We're not backing down, Robert, not this time." They spent the morning preparing lunch. Nothing fancy, just the kind of meal they had always made for family gatherings. Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh-baked bread, and apple pie for dessert. Margaret moved through the familiar motions of cooking, finding comfort in the routine even as her stomach churned with nerves. At 11:45, they were both dressed and waiting in the living room. Margaret wore a simple blue dress, and Robert had put on slacks and a button-down shirt. They sat on the couch, holding hands, watching the clock tick closer to noon. At precisely 12:03, a silver BMW pulled into their driveway. Through the window, they watched David step out of the car. He was a tall man with dark hair beginning to grey at the temples, wearing expensive jeans and a cashmere sweater. He looked successful, polished, and, as he approached the door, distinctly uncomfortable. Robert opened the door before David could knock. "Hello, son," he said, his voice neutral. "Hi, Dad." David stepped inside, and there was an awkward moment where he seemed uncertain whether to hug his father or shake his hand. He opted for a brief, stiff hug. "Mum," he added, as Margaret appeared in the doorway, receiving a similarly awkward embrace. "Lunch is ready," Margaret said. "Let's eat first, we can talk after." The meal was painfully quiet. David made several attempts at small talk, commenting on the weather, mentioning a case he was working on, asking about their health, but neither Margaret nor Robert engaged beyond polite, minimal responses. They had lived too long and been hurt too deeply to pretend everything was fine over pot roast. David seemed to sense this. He ate mechanically, stealing glances at his parents, clearly trying to read the situation. By the time Margaret served the apple pie, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "The pie is excellent, Mom," David said, taking a bite. "Just like I remember." "Thank you," Margaret replied simply. David set down his fork and took a deep breath. "Okay, I can't do this anymore. Can we please talk about what's going on? This whole meal has felt like I'm dining with strangers instead of my parents." "That's interesting," Robert said, his tone measured, "because your mother and I have felt like strangers to you for years now. It's fascinating that you're only noticing now that we're treating you the way you've been treating us." David's jaw tightened. "That's not fair, Dad. I've been busy—" "Stop," Margaret interrupted, raising her hand. "We've heard the excuses, David. We've heard them from you, from Patricia, from Thomas. You're all too busy. Your lives are too complicated. Your schedules are too full. We understand that. What we don't understand is why your father and I are always the thing that gets cut from those busy schedules." "That's not true." "When was the last time you visited us?" Robert asked. "Not for a holiday that you then cancelled. Not for a phone call that lasted 5 minutes. I mean really visited, sat with us, talked to us, acted like you wanted to be here instead of acting like it was an obligation." David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. His face reddened slightly as he searched his memory. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "It's been a while. 2 years and 4 months, Margaret said quietly. The last time you were in this house was September of 2022. You came for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon. You spent most of that time on your phone dealing with work emails. Emma and Noah played on their tablets the entire time. Jessica didn't come. She had a spa appointment she didn't want to miss. David looked genuinely shocked. It's been that long? Yes, Robert said. And that visit was the exception, not the rule. Before that, we hadn't seen you for nearly a year. We've watched our grandchildren grow up through photographs on social media, David. We know more about their lives from Facebook than we do from you. I send you pictures. Pictures are not the same as presents, Margaret said, her voice cracking slightly. Pictures don't hug us. Pictures don't tell us they love us. Pictures don't make memories with us. David sat back in his chair, running his hand through his hair, a gesture he had done since childhood when he was stressed. I didn't realize it had gotten this bad. I honestly didn't. That's part of the problem, Robert said. You didn't realize because you weren't paying attention. You were too wrapped up in your own life to notice that you were abandoning us. I never meant to abandon you. But you did, Margaret said firmly. You all did. And it reached its breaking point on Christmas Day, when we sat in this house alone, surrounded by food we had prepared for 5 people, waiting for children who never came. Do you have any idea what that felt like, David? To be forgotten on the one day that's supposed to be about family? Tears began rolling down David's cheeks. Margaret was surprised. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen her eldest son cry. He had always been the stoic one, the controlled one, the one who never let emotions show. I'm sorry, he whispered. God, Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I was selfish. I was thoughtless. I told myself that you would understand, that you'd always be there, that I could make it up to you later. I kept putting you off because there was always something that seemed more important or more urgent or more... He stopped, shaking his head. There's no excuse. I failed you. We all failed you. Margaret reached across the table and took her son's hand. We needed to hear you say that, David. We needed you to acknowledge the hurt instead of making excuses for it. I do acknowledge it, David said, squeezing her hand. And I want to fix it. I want to be better. I want Emma and Noah to know their grandparents. I want to be the kind of son you raised me to be, but I don't know if I even remember how anymore. Robert's eyes were wet now too. You start by showing up, not just physically, but emotionally. You start by making us a priority instead of an afterthought. You start by teaching your children that family matters, that elderly parents matter, that love requires effort and presence. I can do that, David said, nodding emphatically. I will do that. Starting now, starting today. We want to believe you, Margaret said gently, but we need to see it, David. We need consistent action over time, not just promises made in a moment of guilt. You'll see it, David assured them. I promise you'll see it. There was a long pause. Then David asked the question that Margaret and Robert had been anticipating. What changed? I don't mean to deflect from my own failures, but something is different with you both. The way you've been talking to me on the phone, the way you're holding yourselves now, something fundamental has shifted. What happened? Margaret and Robert exchanged a long look. They had discussed this moment extensively over the past few weeks. How much should they tell David? When should they tell him? What would happen when he found out about the money? Something did happen, Margaret said slowly. The day after Christmas, we received unexpected news. News that changed our perspective on many things, including how we've been letting ourselves be treated by our children. David leaned forward, his attorney instincts clearly engaged. What kind of news? Robert stood up and walked to the drawer where they kept important documents. He pulled out Eleanor's letter, now safely stored in a protective sleeve, and brought it back to the table. Do you remember, Robert began, sitting back down, when you were about 14 or 15, there was a young woman who lived with us for several months. A pregnant woman from Taiwan? David's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. Vaguely. I was away at college during some of that time, I think. Patricia might remember better. There was a baby, right? Her name was Eleanor Chen, Margaret said. She came into our lives when she had nothing. No money, no family, no support. Her husband had abandoned her while she was pregnant. We took her in, gave her a place to stay, helped her through the birth of her son and the first months of his life. I remember now, David said, nodding. She was really kind. She used to cook these amazing dinners. Whatever happened to her? She built an extraordinary life, Robert said. She married a good man, had another child, and eventually created a successful chain of restaurants throughout the Pacific Northwest. She became quite wealthy. David listened intently, clearly wondering where this story was going. 6 months ago, Eleanor died of pancreatic cancer, Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. Before she died, she made arrangements through her attorney to find us. She never forgot what we did for her, David. Never forgot that we gave her hope when she had none. Robert slid Eleanor's letter across the table to David. She left us this. David picked up the letter carefully and began reading. Margaret watched her son's face as he absorbed Eleanor's words. She saw his expression shift from curiosity to surprise to something like awe. When he finished, he set the letter down gently and looked at his parents with new understanding. "She left you $5 million, he said softly. "That's what she meant by inadequate to express my gratitude." "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "The money arrived in our account on December 29th. 3 days after the worst Christmas of our lives, we received the most extraordinary gift we've ever been given." David sat back, processing this information. Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. This was the moment of truth, the moment when they would discover whether David's apology had been genuine or whether the mention of money would change everything. "That's incredible," David finally said. "Mom, Dad, that's absolutely incredible. You helped someone when she desperately needed it, and decades later she remembered you. She honored you. That's—" He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. "It made us realize something important," Robert said, watching his son carefully. "Eleanor, who we helped for less than a year, who we hadn't seen in 30 years, remembered us and valued us enough to leave us a fortune. Meanwhile, our own children, who we raised and loved and sacrificed for during their entire lives, couldn't even spare one day to visit us." The contrast was illuminating. David winced at the words, but he didn't argue. "I can see how that would be painful. Hell, just hearing you say it out loud is painful. We're telling you this for 2 reasons," Margaret said. "First, because you deserve to know the truth about what's been happening in our lives. And second, because we want you to understand that the money isn't what matters to us. We've already decided what to do with most of it." "What do you mean?" David asked. "We're creating a charitable foundation in Eleanor's name," Robert explained. "The Eleanor Chen Second Chances Foundation. It will help immigrant women and families in crisis, providing housing, job training, English classes, legal support, everything Eleanor needed and more. We're using her gift to help others the way we once helped her." David's eyes widened slightly. "You're giving away $5 million? "Most of it," Margaret corrected. "We've kept enough to ensure we're secure for the rest of our lives, and we've set aside funds to help people in our community who are struggling. But the majority will go into the foundation. We don't need millions of dollars," Robert added. "We never have. What we need is purpose, dignity, and to be surrounded by people who genuinely care about us. Money can't buy those things." David was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything his parents had told him. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm ashamed." "Of what?" Margaret asked. "Of myself, of how I've behaved. Here you are, receiving this incredible windfall. And instead of thinking about fancy cars or world cruises or moving to some retirement mansion, you're thinking about how to help other people. You're thinking about legacy and compassion and making the world better. And meanwhile, I've been so focused on making partner, earning more money, climbing the ladder, I forgot what actually matters." He looked directly at his parents. "You've always been the best people I know, and I forgot that. I took it for granted. I assumed you'd always be there, always be understanding, always forgive me for putting my career and my comfort ahead of you. I became the kind of person I swore I'd never be." "It's not too late to change," Margaret said gently. "That's what we want you to understand, David. It's not too late, but you have to choose it. You have to decide that we matter enough to make real changes in your priorities and your life." "I choose it," David said immediately. "I choose you. I choose being the son you deserve. I choose teaching my children that their grandparents are treasures to be cherished, not obligations to be avoided." Robert reached across and gripped his son's shoulder. "Then that's enough. That's all we've ever wanted. To know that we matter to you, that we're not just names in your phone that you call out of guilt once in a while." David covered his father's hand with his own. "You matter. You've always mattered. I just lost sight of it somewhere along the way, but I'm finding my way back. I promise you I am." They sat together for a while, the 3 of them, talking more honestly than they had in years. David asked questions about the foundation, about their plans, about Eleanor's life and legacy. Margaret and Robert shared stories, showed him photographs, and let him read more of Eleanor's letter. At one point, David asked, Have you told Patricia and Tom yet? About the money? No, Robert said. We wanted to talk to you first. You're the oldest. And frankly, we wanted to see how you would react when you learned about it. And? David asked cautiously. How did I do? Better than we feared, Margaret admitted. We were worried you might immediately start thinking about what you could gain from it, or start making suggestions about how we should spend it. But you didn't. You listened. You understood what it meant. That gives us hope. I won't lie and say the money didn't cross my mind, David said honestly. I'm a lawyer. I'm trained to think about assets and estates and inheritance. But the truth is, Mom, Dad, I make good money. Jessica and I are financially comfortable. We don't need your money. What Emma and Noah need is their grandparents. What I need is my parents. That's worth more than any inheritance. We appreciate you saying that, Robert said, and we appreciate your honesty. But you should know that we've made arrangements in our will. A portion of the money will go to you and your siblings after we're gone, but the bulk of it will continue funding the foundation in perpetuity. Helena's legacy will continue long after we're dead. That's as it should be, David said. It was her gift and you're using it the way she wanted, to help others. I respect that deeply. As the afternoon wore on, they moved from the dining room to the living room, continuing their conversation. David called Jessica and told her he'd be staying longer than planned. He didn't tell her why, but he made it clear that this time with his parents was important. Around 4 o'clock, David asked if he could see more of the foundation plans. Margaret brought out the folders and documents they had been accumulating, incorporation papers, mission statements, budget projections, and letters of support from community organizations. David reviewed everything with his professional eye. This is really well thought out, he said, impressed. You've got solid legal structure, clear goals, and realistic budgeting. Have you officially filed the non-profit paperwork yet? It's in process, Robert said. Our attorney said it should be finalized within the next few weeks. Who's your attorney? Robert gave him the name of the small local firm they had been working with. David nodded thoughtfully. They're good people, he said. But if you'd like, I could help too. I do corporate law, but I have colleagues who specialize in non-profit law. I could connect you with them, maybe help navigate some of the more complex legal requirements. No charge, obviously. I'd just like to help. If you want me to. Margaret and Robert exchanged surprised glances. This was David offering to be involved, offering to contribute his skills and connections. It felt like the first real step toward the change he had promised. We'd appreciate that, Margaret said warmly. Thank you, David. As evening approached, David reluctantly stood to leave. I should get back. Jessica will be wondering if I got lost. He paused, then added, but I want to come back soon, next weekend, if that's okay. And I want to bring Emma and Noah. I want them to spend real time with you, not just a rushed visit where everyone's on their devices. I want them to hear your stories, learn from you, get to know you properly. We'd love that, Margaret said, embracing her son tightly. We've missed them so much. They've missed you too, even if they don't fully understand it yet, David said. They ask about you more than you probably realize. I just haven't been good about facilitating those connections. That changes now. At the door, David turned back one more time. Thank you for not giving up on me. I know you could have. I know I gave you plenty of reasons to. But you didn't, and I'm grateful for that. You're our son, Robert said simply. We love you. That doesn't mean we'll accept being treated poorly, but it does mean we'll always hope for better. Always believe you can change. That's what parents do. After David left, Margaret and Robert stood together at the window watching his car disappear down the street. They were both emotionally exhausted but also cautiously hopeful. Do you think he meant it? Margaret asked quietly. Do you think he'll really change? I think he wants to, Robert replied. Whether he can follow through remains to be seen. But today felt different. It felt real. What about Patricia and Thomas? 1 down, 2 to go, Robert said with a slight smile. We'll see if David talks to them, or if we need to have similar conversations with each of them individually. As it turned out, they didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Sunday, Patricia called. She was crying before Margaret even finished saying hello. Mom, David told me everything, Patricia sobbed. About Christmas, about how terrible we've been to you and Dad, about Eleanor and the money and the foundation. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. Margaret listened as her daughter poured out her guilt and regret. Patricia explained how Frank had been controlling their social calendar for years, how she had allowed him to dismiss her family as small-town nobodies, how she had been too weak to stand up to him and insist on maintaining connections with her parents. I've been a coward, Patricia said through her tears. I chose my marriage over my parents, and that was wrong. It was so wrong, and I can't believe it took David's phone call for me to see it clearly. Patricia, Margaret said gently, you can apologize, and we appreciate that you are. But like I told your brother, we need to see change. We need consistent action, not just words spoken in a moment of guilt. You'll see it, Patricia promised. I'm already planning to drive out next Saturday. Can I come? Can I see you and Dad? Of course you can come, this is your home. You're always welcome here, we just need you to want to be here, not to feel obligated. The call with Thomas came that evening. Unlike his siblings, Thomas didn't cry or become emotional. Instead, he was quiet, thoughtful, and painfully honest. I don't have excuses, he said simply. David has been filling me in on everything, and the truth is I let my career consume my life. I convinced myself that providing financially for my family was the same as being present for them. I convinced myself that work obligations justified missing important moments. I was wrong about all of it. What made you realize that? Robert asked, having taken the phone from Margaret. Two things, Thomas replied. First, David's description of you two sitting alone on Christmas made me physically sick to my stomach. I kept imagining it, you waiting for us, the food getting cold, the house empty, and I realized we did that to you. We caused that pain, and second, when David told me about Eleanor and what she left you, I realized something important. What's that? A stranger. Someone you helped for less than a year, valued you more than your own children did. That's unforgivable, Dad. We should have been the ones taking care of you, honoring you, showing gratitude for everything you did for us. Instead, it took someone from outside our family to recognize your worth. That's shameful. Robert's throat tightened. Of all his children, Thomas had always been the most difficult to read, the most independent, the one who kept his emotions closest to his chest. Hearing him speak so openly was unexpected and deeply moving. It's not too late, Tommy, Robert said, using his son's childhood nickname. It's not too late to rebuild what we've lost. I want to, Thomas said. I really do. And I promise I'll do better. Starting with this, I've already submitted a request to my supervisor to be reassigned to a regional position instead of national. It would mean less travel, less money, but more time at home. More time to build relationships with the people who actually matter, including you and Mum. That's a big change, Robert said, surprised. It's an overdue change, Thomas corrected. I've been using work as an excuse to avoid dealing with real life for too long. Time to grow up and face what's important. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Robert watched with cautious optimism as their children began to follow through on their promises. David came the next Saturday with Emma and Noah, and for the first time in years it was a real visit. The children played board games with their grandparents, helped Margaret bake cookies, and listened to Robert's stories about the old days. Jessica even came, apologizing for her own role in the family's distance. Patricia drove out alone the week after that and spent an entire day with her parents. She helped Margaret in the garden, talked honestly about her struggles in her marriage, and promised to work on establishing better boundaries with Frank. She admitted that she had lost herself somewhere along the way and wanted to rediscover who she was beyond being Mrs. Frank Morrison. Thomas called every other evening just to check in and talk. He asked about the foundation, about their lives, about their health and their plans. He asked questions about their past, their experiences, their wisdom, things he should have been asking for years, but never had. In mid-February, 6 weeks after receiving Eleanor's inheritance, Margaret and Robert officially launched the Eleanor Chen Second Chances Foundation. The paperwork had been finalized, the board of directors assembled, including Helen Patterson as executive director and, surprisingly, David as legal counsel. And they had secured a small office space downtown that would serve as the foundation's headquarters. The local newspaper ran a story about the foundation, though Margaret and Robert insisted on keeping the funding source vague. They were described as local philanthropists who wished to honor the memory of an immigrant woman who had overcome tremendous hardship. The story didn't mention the $5 million or their personal connection to Eleanor. They wanted the focus to be on the mission, not on themselves. Applications for assistance began arriving almost immediately. A Syrian refugee family that had recently arrived in the county with nothing but the clothes on their backs. A woman from Honduras who had escaped domestic violence and was living in her car with her 2 children. A Vietnamese teenager who had aged out of the foster care system, and was struggling to afford college while working 3 jobs. Margaret and Robert reviewed each application carefully, consulting with Helen and the board, making decisions about who to help and how. Every time they wrote a check or arranged for services, they thought of Eleanor. They wondered if this was how she had felt when she was helping others. This mixture of grief for what people had endured and hope for what they might become with a little support. In early March, Margaret received a letter that made her cry. It was from Daniel Chen, Eleanor's son, whom she remembered as a beautiful baby and a sweet toddler. The letter read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Daniel Chen. I am Eleanor Chen Wu's son, the baby you helped my mother care for when we had nowhere else to go. I'm writing to you because my sister Grace and I recently learned about the foundation you've created in our mother's honor. First, thank you. Thank you for saving my mother's life all those years ago. Thank you for giving her the hope and support she needed to build the life she dreamed of. And thank you for honoring her memory in such a meaningful way. My mother spoke of you often throughout my life. She told me the story of how you took us in, how Mrs. Sullivan was there when I was born, how Mr. Sullivan fixed things around your house and refused to let my mother feel like a burden. She said you treated her with dignity when she had every reason to feel ashamed. You gave her more than shelter. You gave her humanity. When she was dying, she told me and Grace that she wanted to leave you something significant. We fully supported her decision. You were not strangers to us, even though we had never met. You were the angels who saved our mother, and by extension saved us. We exist because you helped her survive. Grace and I would very much like to meet you if you're willing. We'd like to hear your stories about our mother from that difficult time in her life. We'd also like to offer our support to the foundation in any way we can. Our mother built something beautiful from the second chance you gave her. We'd like to help you give that same chance to others. Please let us know if you would be open to a visit. We would consider it an honor to meet the people our mother loved so deeply. With gratitude and respect, Daniel Chen." Margaret showed the letter to Robert, who read it with tears streaming down his face. They immediately called the number Daniel had included at the bottom of the letter. The conversation that followed was emotional and beautiful. Daniel and Grace, now 42 and 28 years old respectively, spoke about their mother with tremendous love. They shared stories about her generosity, her work ethic, her dedication to helping others, and her insistence that kindness was the most important currency in life. "She made us promise something when she was dying," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "She made us promise that we would always help others the way she had been helped, that we would never become so successful or comfortable that we forgot what it was like to struggle." "That sounds exactly like Eleanor," Margaret said, smiling through her tears. They arranged for Daniel and Grace to visit Maplewood in April. Margaret and Robert cleaned the guest rooms, prepared for their arrival, and felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about meeting the children of the woman they had helped so long ago. When Daniel and Grace arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-April, it was like welcoming family home. Daniel looked remarkably like his father James had, tall, dark-haired, with gentle eyes. Grace had her mother's beautiful smile and warm demeanor. They embraced Margaret and Robert like they had known them forever. Over the course of the weekend, they shared stories, looked at photographs, and cried together. Daniel and Grace brought pictures of Eleanor throughout her life, her wedding to Henry, the opening of her restaurants, family vacations, and her final months battling cancer. They also brought a video that Eleanor had recorded shortly before her death. Margaret and Robert watched the video with Daniel and Grace beside them. Eleanor appeared on the screen, thinner than Margaret remembered, but still beautiful, with the same kind eyes. "Robert and Margaret," Eleanor said in the video, her voice weak but clear. "If you're watching this, then Daniel and Grace have found you, and you know what I've left you. I hope it doesn't feel like too much of a burden. I hope it brings you joy rather than stress." She paused, gathering her strength. "I want you to know that you were always in my heart, always. Every success I had, every happy moment I experienced, I carried you with me. You taught me that goodness exists even in the darkest times. You taught me that strangers can become family. You taught me that love doesn't require blood relation. It requires compassion, respect, and a willingness to help when help is needed." Eleanor smiled, that radiant smile that Margaret remembered. "I hope my children treat you with the love and respect I never got to show you in person during my later years. I hope they make you feel like the family you are, because you are family to me, always and forever. Thank you for everything. Thank you for my life. Thank you for my son. Thank you for showing me that I deserve to survive and thrive." The video ended, and the four of them sat in silence, crying together. "She recorded that 2 weeks before she died," Daniel said quietly. "She was in a lot of pain, but she insisted on doing it. She said she needed you to hear those words from her." "We hear them," Margaret said, reaching over to squeeze Daniel's hand, "and we feel them. Your mother's love has been the greatest gift we could have received, greater even than the money. She reminded us what real gratitude looks like, what real family looks like." Grace pulled out an envelope. "We have something else for you. Daniel and I talked about it, and we want to contribute to the foundation. We're donating $250,000, $125,000 from each of us, to honor our mother and to support the work you're doing in her name." Robert's eyes widened. "That's incredibly generous, but you don't need to." "We want to," Daniel interrupted gently. "Our mother left us very well provided for. This is how we want to use some of that inheritance, to continue her legacy of helping others. Please accept it." Margaret and Robert did accept it, with tremendous gratitude. Daniel and Grace also agreed to join the Foundation's advisory board, offering their expertise and connections to help expand the Foundation's reach. Over that weekend, the two families bonded in ways that felt both new and ancient. It was as if Eleanor's spirit hovered over them, bringing together the people she had loved most. They visited Eleanor's grave together, Margaret and Robert's first time seeing it, and laid flowers while sharing more memories. On Sunday evening, as Daniel and Grace were preparing to leave, Grace said something that struck Margaret deeply. "You know what's interesting?" Grace said. "My mother always told us that the measure of a person's character is how they treat others when there's nothing to be gained from it. You helped my mother when she couldn't give you anything in return. You didn't know she would become successful. You didn't know she would remember you. You just helped because it was the right thing to do. That's real character." "Your mother had that same character," Robert replied. "She could have forgotten us, could have moved on with her successful life and never looked back. But she didn't. She honored us in death because we honored her in her hardest moments. That's the kind of person she was, someone who never forgot a kindness." After Daniel and Grace left, Margaret and Robert sat together in the living room, holding hands as they had done so many times in recent months. "It's been quite a journey," Margaret said softly. 4 months ago, we were abandoned and alone. Now we're surrounded by purpose, by new relationships, by hope. And our own children are finally coming back to us," Robert added. "Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. David visits every other week now. Patricia calls several times a week. Thomas has already visited twice since taking his new position." "Do you think they would have changed if it hadn't been for the money?" Margaret asked. "If Eleanor hadn't left us the inheritance, would our children have continued ignoring us?" Robert considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Maybe eventually the pain of Christmas would have prompted them to examine their behavior. Or maybe not. But here's what I do know. The money didn't change who we are. It just gave us the clarity and confidence to demand better treatment. Even without the inheritance, I think we would have eventually stood up for ourselves. The money just accelerated the process." "You're right," Margaret agreed. "And in a strange way, I'm grateful for the pain of Christmas. Without hitting that bottom, we might never have found the strength to change the dynamic with our children. We might have continued accepting scraps of attention for the rest of our lives." "Eleanor gave us more than money," Robert mused. "She gave us perspective. She showed us what loyalty looks like, what gratitude looks like, what real love looks like. She set a standard that our own children weren't meeting, and once we saw that clearly, we couldn't unsee it." Margaret leaned her head on Robert's shoulder. "I wish she could see what we've built. I wish she could see the foundation helping people just like it helped her. I wish she could know that her gift is rippling outward exactly the way she hoped." "Maybe she does know," Robert said softly. "Maybe somehow, wherever she is, Eleanor knows that her legacy is alive and growing, that the kindness she received is being multiplied and spread to others, that her story is inspiring people to be more compassionate." They sat in comfortable silence as evening turned to night. Outside, Maplewood settled into its quiet rhythms. The house on Elm Street, once so empty and dark, now felt full of purpose and possibility. In the 4 months since Christmas, everything had changed, and yet nothing had changed. Margaret and Robert were still the same people, modest, kind, dedicated to helping others, but they had learned to value themselves more, to demand respect from those who should have been giving it freely, and to use their unexpected fortune to create lasting good in the world. The Eleanor Chen Second Chances Foundation had already helped 17 families in its first 2 months of operation. 17 families who had been given hope when they had none, support when they needed it most, and dignity when the world had tried to strip it away, just like Eleanor. And Margaret and Robert's 3 children, David, Patricia, and Thomas, were slowly, imperfectly learning to be the children their parents had always deserved. The damage of years of neglect couldn't be repaired overnight, but it could be repaired with consistent effort, genuine remorse, and a commitment to change. The money sat in investment accounts, carefully managed to ensure it would continue funding the foundation for decades to come. But the real wealth, the kind that mattered, couldn't be measured in dollars. It was measured in Saturday afternoons, with grandchildren who now knew their grandparents' stories, in phone calls that came from genuine desire rather than obligation, in the faces of immigrant families who found hope when they had none, in the legacy of a woman who never forgot a kindness, and in the ripple effects of compassion that would echo long after Margaret and Robert were gone. Eleanor Chen had given them a second chance, not just financially but emotionally and spiritually, and they had used that chance to transform not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others. As Margaret turned off the lights that night, she whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had changed everything, and in the darkness, she could almost feel Eleanor smiling back.